good evening. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 17. We're going to be picking up where we left off, as we do, going verse by verse through the Gospel of Matthew right now in this series called Seeing Christ Clearly. And so because of the snow last week, it's very possible that some of you missed the message, but you can always watch it online. But I think it's important that we connect last week's message to this week's message because one flows into the other one. So last week we talked about the transfiguration, where Jesus took his inner circle up the mountaintop, revealed his glory to them, showed who he was. Moses and Elijah are come down to confirm his presence. God the Father speaks, confirming his identity, and Peter, James, and John are there to witness this moment. I don't know if any of you have ever had a mountaintop experience in your faith. I think most of us have had moments where God just seems to be speaking clearly and directly to us, where he is just confirming, often in very powerful ways, who he is and what he's doing. Maybe it was a summer of mission work, or maybe it was a retreat or a camp, or maybe it was just a specific moment in your life where God just spoke so clearly to you, and you have this sort of mountaintop, clear, unobstructed vision of Jesus, where you know who he is, you hear what he's calling you to do, and it just seems in some way sort of tangible. But then what happens? We see, come down the mountain, right? And they don't just come down the mountain, they come down the mountain back into the difficulties of life. And maybe that's what you have experienced as well, where you have this moment of clarity, and then life shows up. Life sort of gets in the way, if you will. One author, Henry Drummond, says this: God does not make the mountains in order to be inhabited. We only ascend to the heights to catch a broader perspective of the earthly surroundings below. But we don't live there. We don't tarry there. The streams begin in the uplands, but these streams descend quickly to gladden the valley below. See, the path of discipleship is a downward path. Jesus himself modeled this. He went from heaven to earth. And so this week we see that Jesus and the disciples come down off the mountain right into the problems of real life. You know, I like to sort of mockingly ask Pastor James sometimes if he has a case of the Mondays, right? We've all had that. And especially as pastors, you know, kind of the highlight of our week often is Sundays. That's when we get to gather with people that we care for, where we get to preach the word, and you just have this moment of joy, worshiping God, and then Monday happens. And I don't know what it is about Satan's tactics that Mondays seem to be filled with, like the extra frustrations. You get all the bad news. You know, I've actually heard of a number of pastors who will take Mondays off as their day off. That is not the way I like to do it. I don't like to wallow. I would rather just like stay busy, right? Like I'll work Monday, I'll take a break on Friday maybe. But see, our faith was not made to only exist in Sunday moments. Our faith was not made to only exist on the mountaintop. Our faith was made to work in the day in and day out of being a disciple of Jesus. See, actually, the reason we gather is so that we can go to the valleys of life and spread the good news of the gospel. The reason we worship is to fuel our work for the kingdom. This is not an end for your week, it is a beginning for the week to come. So as the disciples come down the mountain, the goal of their vision, the goal of the transfiguration, was to change their perspective of Jesus and his work, so that now they can see the problems that around them, see the difficulties that people are facing, and they can approach them from a different angle. They can have a different perspective. They can be strengthened for what they're called to do. See, so much of the story lately in this gospel has focused on Jesus' heavenly identity, his path to the cross, his future glory. But now we see that reality, the day in and day out, is still there waiting. This is sort of a snap right back to reality. Oh, there goes gravity. I can't say it without saying that. It's deep in my DNA as a college student. See, when we preach the glory of God, the beauty of the gospel, the promise of redemption, all of a sudden, the problems of life intrude and they threaten to take our eyes off of what we've seen, to distract us, to dissuade us, to discourage us. In fact, I think the daily problems of life often obscure the vision of Christ that we want people to see. The practical daily problems for many people are the thing that keeps them from seeing Christ. You're trying to elevate people's vision, but they're worried about what's happening right now. Where am I going to get my next meal? How am I going to deal with this problem? How am I going to pay this bill? How am I going to deal with this person? And I think this is a failure on the part of many of our churches, myself often included, that I fail to connect the gospel to the daily reality of our broken world. But Jesus walked in our broken world. He talked to regular folks like us. The gospel was never meant to take us away from the world. It was meant to equip us to be children of light in this world. Now, that doesn't mean that we're preaching just pragmatic sermons or that we're only trying to help people's physical and felt needs. But it does mean that the gospel impacts everything. It impacts the way we talk to people, the way we care for people, the way we provide. It affects our attitude. It affects our decisions. It affects our relationships. It affects the way we vote. It affects every aspect of our life because Jesus is Lord of everything. He's not just Lord of this room on Sunday nights. He's not just Lord of your life when you're reading your Bible. He's Lord of everything, including the way I treat people when I'm driving my car in this city. Ouch, difficult. That's when I think the most ungodly thoughts, by the way. It's a daily test of my sanctification. So my question tonight is just I want you to think about this as we look through this passage. What does real world faith look like? And maybe what does it not look like? What does real world faith look like? What does it look like to trust Jesus about everything all the time? Let's look at this passage starting in verse 14 of Matthew 17. It says, "When they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' He said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" Look at these first three verses and notice that they have a problem beyond their abilities, just like we do. Our problem is beyond us. So here we have this problem of this boy who has seizures. Now these are particularly terrible because when he has these seizures, he's throwing himself into the fire, he's hurting himself, he's suffering terribly, and his father is upset about this, rightfully so. This isn't one of those things that when you're dealing with, you want someone to just say, well, I'll pray for you. You're in my thoughts and prayers. Not when your son is hurting himself with this problem, right? We know from verse 18 that this is caused by a demon, which Jesus makes clear. So here's the thing. Jesus has healed many people oppressed by demons throughout the gospel. But this one is causing real world pain, suffering that is hurting this young man. The father doesn't know what to do. I mean, he's at the point where he's coming to Jesus to heal him. He hears that this man can heal these sorts of problems, so he's come to him. You imagine that at this point, he's tried the doctors. He's tried the remedies. He's taken all the advice. He's put it on Facebook, and he's put all the oils on it that it could possibly do, and now he just has no other options. He's out of options. He's desperate, so he comes to Jesus. He needs a real solution. He needs his son to be healed. Now, I think we have to balance the realities of the gospel. We have to balance the realities that the gospel affects our world now, but also has promises for our future to come. Now, what happens if you live in the now only? You're only worried about what you can see and touch, how much money's in your bank account, the clothes that are on your back, right? You're worried about how you feel in this moment, your comfort, right? Your provision. Or there's those who focus only on what is to come. And the result is nothing now matters. Everything's, we'll just pray about it, right? One day the Lord will sort it out. Now, they're both true, right? God cares for your now, and he has a promise for your future. So we get to see how those two things interact and the way Jesus deals with this. This is why we as a church have to care about issues that affect real people now. That's why justice matters. But we also don't pin our hopes on a sinful world now. We know that ultimately Jesus is coming to restore and redeem. So we wait with patience, we endure suffering, we live for a world to come, but we fight sin now, we pursue justice now, we live by the realities of the kingdom, even as we await its ultimate fulfillment. And if we get out of balance there, you start to see deficiencies in our discipleship. So this man, he comes to Jesus. It says he comes to him kneeling, and he uses these words. He says, "Lord, have mercy." Notice his posture as he comes to Jesus. He doesn't come demanding a miracle. He comes begging for a miracle. He is worshiping. He is bowing down. He is submitting. He is addressing Jesus with reverence. I think this is a very distinct contrast from the response we often see from others in the gospel. You see it sometimes from the disciples. You see it from the Pharisees. People who sort of come demanding or accusing or questioning Jesus. Prove yourself. He doesn't come saying, prove yourself. He's saying, please, Lord, have mercy. This is a familiar phrase. If you go back to Matthew 15, which I think someone preached a pretty good sermon on it a while ago, and you look at the Canaanite woman who comes to him in Matthew 15:22, it says, "Behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.'" Sounds familiar, right? You know, actually, in that situation, she is recognizing Jesus' identity even more than the religious leaders at the time. Because she's a Canaanite woman. He's a Jewish rabbi. This is a real problem religiously, culturally, ethnically, and she's going to him, calling him Lord, calling him Son of David. Apparently her problem's bad enough that she's willing to seek a Jewish teacher, and she's recognizing his identity more than the Jewish religious leaders are at the time. She has a greater theological understanding of Jesus than the Pharisees. But this attitude is one of humility. See, I think one of the great dangers of modern spirituality is presumption. That we come to Jesus and we presume that he must do what we ask. We presume that he owes us something. See, a defining feature of discipleship is humility. Jesus being the greatest example of humility, his life completely dedicated to serving, even though he's the one who could actually demand to be served. Rather, he served us. But when we approach God, how often do you think this in your head? Okay, God, I'll do X if you do Why? Right? You do that little bargain. Like, God, if you help me here, I won't miss church until I forget. Right? I'll put extra money in the offering plate. Or you think something like this: there's no way that God could do blank. As if we get to define what God can and cannot do. Or, God, if you really love me, you'll do this for me. See, that's not the heart of a genuine disciple. The heart of a disciple says, Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. You don't owe me anything. I don't deserve anything, but I'm coming to you because I'm desperate for your mercy. See, this is why humility has to define our character. It's why arrogant, overbearing, argumentative, or one of my favorite words in the Bible, pugnacious people should never be leaders in Christ's church. They're not gatekeepers of orthodoxy if they're prideful. True Christian discipleship always, I've thought about this a lot, always cultivates humility. Be skeptical of any person who claims Christ but isn't growing in humility. And that has to carry over into our relationship with God. We never approach God saying we deserve or we've earned. We don't have rights before God. Everything we have is a gift. Everything He gives is grace. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Philippians 3:11. It's a kind of a throwaway verse for most people. But the Apostle Paul, I don't know if you heard of him, has a pretty good resume as a Christian. Wrote a few things that we like to read, kind of lived what he taught, right? If anyone could sort of say, look, I am sort of like a varsity Christian. I'm doing pretty good. I know I'm going to heaven. I'm confident of my salvation. Here's what he says in Philippians 3:11. He says, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Literally translated, he says this: if perhaps I might attain. Even Paul, when he approaches God, says, look, it's still by your grace that I attain the resurrection of the dead. It's still by your mercy that I get to go to heaven. John Calvin puts it this way: if we think we have anything left to ourselves, it is not humility. The gateway to salvation is not open unless we have laid aside all pride. And that's why I love the model of this man here. Notice, this desperate man is coming. Who is he making the request for? It's not for himself. No, it's for his son. Just like the Canaanite woman is coming to pray, to ask for mercy for her daughter. See, the heart of the gospel is others focus. It's why the prayers in the New Testament are intercessory prayers. They're prayers for others primarily. There are very few prayers that start off with I. Almost every prayer is praying for someone else. Read Paul's prayers. He asks others to pray for him, and then he prays for them. See, here, demon-possessed people do not intercede for themselves. Intercession is an act of love and compassion. I can't really say that I care for hurting and oppressed people if I don't carry their requests to God, if I don't take their needs to the Lord. If I expect everyone else to see their problem and find the Lord, then I don't care for them. But when I go to God on behalf of others, in humility, in desperate prayer, praying for their salvation, for their deliverance, for their healing, that is love that comes from the gospel. The same thing is true of the centurion in Matthew chapter 8, who goes to Jesus asking for his servant to be healed. Notice the difference here. All of these people in desperate circumstances are going to Jesus on behalf of another person. So here's the problem in verse 16. It says, I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. This is a big problem. This becomes kind of the central problem of this passage. That this man brought his son to the disciples to be healed, and they couldn't do it. Now the question becomes, why did he take his son to the disciples rather than to Jesus? Well, one possibility is this: that Jesus and the inner circle were still up the mountain. And so they weren't there to find. So they were left with sort of like the B team, right? Well, I guess you guys are here. I'm desperate. I'll do what I can do, and we'll go to these guys. It kind of feels like when you try to save a few bucks doing a project at your house because you don't want to pay the pro, and then you end up with one of these like DIY disaster stories. I saw this whole slideshow. It was like a BuzzFeed slideshow about DIY disasters. And my favorite one was this person who had installed a toilet, but the door was right there, so the door wouldn't open. So then they just cut out the shape of the toilet so that you could just open the door. And you're like, well, I don't really think the door does me any good if there's a big hole in it, right? But this is what happens when you kind of try to save a few bucks. You're like, I don't really want to pay for a professional. You know, it's like if you're going in to get surgery, you don't want to get a deal on it, right? Like, I'll pay full price. Like, I don't need a coupon for that. Like, I want this to be done right. They here are settling for this lesser group of folks, these disciples who obviously can't seem to heal his son. I do wonder how often we settle for lesser solutions when we should be going to Jesus. You know, we're lonely, so we enter into a relationship that's not that good when we should be finding our companionship in Christ. We have this problem, so we cut corners, trying to think that we can come up with a solution outside of Jesus, and what does it end up doing? It ends up leaving us in a worse situation, unable to solve the problem. We should not settle for lesser things, because there's certainly a world of difference between Jesus and his disciples. But there's this other reality that I think we have to confront. These disciples, if you go back to Matthew 10, we're given authority to cast out demons and heal diseases. If you go to Matthew 10, chapter 1, Jesus says, he called them, his 12 disciples, and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal every disease and every affliction. The failure here seems to be less about this man going to the wrong people and about these disciples who are unable to do what Jesus himself had called them to do. So we see a problem beyond our abilities, but we see clearly a Savior we don't deserve. Look at verses 17 and 18. It says, "And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" There's just this gap between Jesus and the people around him. This is language we've heard from him many times in the Gospel of Matthew. Look at this generation around me. And back in Matthew chapter 11, he said, But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. This was a story about John the Baptist. But the whole point there is, look, you're never going to be happy. This generation's never going to be happy. If we play a song, you won't dance. You're not happy. If we're sad, you won't mourn. Which is it? What do you want? Nothing's going to please you. Kind of in that description of this generation, you kind of get the sense that they're looking for the Goldilocks religious leader. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. I mean, how often do we come to Jesus like that? Like, we want him to encourage us. We want him to teach us some new things, but don't make me too uncomfortable. Don't make me give up too much sin. Don't make me change too much of the way I think. Just, Jesus, if you could just kind of keep it simple in here, things that I kind of like. A nice worship song every now and then, maybe like a tear here and there, but like a happy tear, that sort of thing. In Matthew 12, he says this way, but he answered to them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." He says the same thing in Matthew 16 that we looked at a few weeks ago. There's this idea that these people following him don't really believe who he is, don't really submit to him, don't really trust him. So here, what does he say? He says, "You are faithless and you are twisted." Or in Matthew 12 and 16, "You are evil and you are adulterous." I think that word adultery is helpful in thinking about what faithlessness really is. That's what we mean. We need to be faithful as spouses. What does faithful mean? It means you can be trusted. It means you don't go to another. It means that your promises are undergirded by your behavior. You don't step out. But how many of us have committed spiritual adultery? Rather than trusting in Jesus, we trust in our tradition, we trust in our own understanding, we trust in our own righteousness or morality. This is a path that will eventually lead to the point of no return. This is the path that leads to the hardening of the heart. When you spurn the grace of God, when you seek your salvation elsewhere, when you seek your identity elsewhere, when you try to belong and you try to find belonging in something other than Jesus, eventually you get to the point of no return. See, our culture, I think, is so inoculated against the truth that Jesus could physically walk down the street right now and people would miss him completely. We have all this information, yet we can't seem to find our way to God. We have no knowledge of the truth. And it scares me, and it should scare us. Jesus is trying to get our attention. In grace, he's trying to say, I have something better for you. Now listen up. Having little kids, one of the things we try to teach them, simple thing about hygiene, is to brush and floss their teeth. Now, my oldest son just hates it because it seems so boring, right? It doesn't seem fun because he hasn't had a cavity yet. He doesn't know that once your tooth gets to the point of no return, there's only one solution, and you're not going to like it, kid. I'm trying to warn him. I'm trying to protect him. I'm trying to prevent him. Jesus here is saying, look, how long am I going to be with you? I'm only going to be here so long. Are you still not paying attention? Are you still not getting it? Thankfully, Pastor James pointed out to me a helpful corollary that I think just makes perfect sense when you look at this passage. I'm calling it Golden Calf 2.0. Remember when Moses went up the mountain in Exodus? He goes up the mountain and he spends time with God. He comes back down with the law of the Lord. He's up there for a bunch of chapters if you're reading Exodus. Maybe I don't know where you are in your Bible reading plan. But at some point, the people are like, he's been gone too long. He's been gone too long. God's forgotten us. Moses has moved on. Who knows what's happened? We should find something else to worship. And so they put all their gold together. They make a golden calf and they start to worship, which doesn't go well for them. Right? God gets angry, Moses gets angry, and Moses is like the dad who catches you smoking cigarettes. He makes you smoke the whole pack. Do you remember they grind up the calf and he makes them drink it? Like, he comes hard in the paint. But you see kind of the same thing here. Jesus goes up on the mountain with his inner circle, and the people are kind of left there, and they're like, and the disciples are like, I guess, I don't know, we'll figure out another way. There is no other way. The only way to life and joy is Jesus. And you kind of get the sense that Jesus has that same sort of exasperation when he says, bring him here to me. The disciples should have been able to do this. The disciples should have been able to heal him. He had given them the authority to do this, and they weren't able to because of their lack of faith. Over and over again, Jesus is disappointed by his disciples. They fall asleep in the garden. They deny him at his trial. They just can't seem to stay faithful. But thankfully, Jesus is still faithful even when we are faithless. Verse 18, Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Despite the shortcomings of the disciples, there's no lack in Jesus. If you read this same story in Mark chapter 9, we see that this boy is cured immediately, visibly. I think it's a beautiful reminder for us that as followers of Jesus, our failures, though they're often pointed out, it's easy for any of us to look at Christians and point out hypocrisy and sin, and those are real and serious problems. Jesus never has any of those shortcomings. No discipleship failure will ever diminish the love, compassion, and perfection of Jesus. So here's my advice to us. Look to Jesus more intently. The more you see his heart, the more you can follow him without fear and anxiety. I wonder what it would look like for us if we served Jesus and followed Jesus knowing that he will never let us down. He will never fall short. He will never run out. There's no scarcity in Jesus. So we can follow him completely and unreservedly. And then we get to this last and final lesson about faith. Verse 19 says, the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? Why could we not cast this demon out? The disciples seemed puzzled by their inability. They should have been able to cast out the demon. That's what Jesus had told them they were able to do, given them authority in Matthew chapter 10. But it seems like their self-esteem is bruised. They've been humiliated. You know, I can imagine that this man brings his son to them, and they say all the words, and they say, be healed, and all that, and nothing happens. And then what do? You're left there having all the authority, but not being able to do it because you lack the faith. I think we all can recognize the shortcomings of what I call positional authority. Right? Maybe you've had that teacher in school who has authority over you as a student because they're a teacher, but they don't have the authority, they don't have the respect of someone you actually want to listen to. Right? Lots of people are in positions of authority, but it doesn't mean that they have power with that authority other than just the power that comes with that position. Because there's a big difference when you meet someone who actually commands your respect by their character and by their person. There's a big difference between formal and informal leadership. I talk a lot when I'm talking to people who feel called to ministry. I use the fitness description of show muscles versus go muscles, right? A lot of people can look the part, they can have the title, they can have the education, but at the end of the day, you don't need a pastor who checks off all the credentials. You need a pastor who has the characteristics that the Bible describes. So if you go to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and read that list, that's the kind of person you need. That's where true pastoral power comes from. You can hire whoever you want, and if they don't have the actual characteristics, the character that comes from the inside, it doesn't really matter. It's why sometimes, we care very much that church is done in the most biblical way that we can imitate, as best we can. We know I'm sure we have a lot of things wrong, but everything we're doing because we think it's right. I promise we're not doing anything that we think is intentionally wrong. But at the end of the day, if you have the perfect church structure and strategy, but you don't have people who exhibit the character of Christ, it doesn't matter. I'd rather have a terrible church structure and leaders and a congregation that follow Christ genuinely. That's way better. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, you get both of those things. That's the goal. But sometimes we settle for position and title, this sort of fake authority, and we forget that we need Jesus' power every day. We are dependent on him completely. So he said to them, here's why you couldn't heal this man, because of your little faith. See, their lack of faith has stopped them from accomplishing what Jesus had commissioned them to do. And so the miracle actually kind of takes a back seat to this lesson on faith that we need to hear today. Why do they lack faith? Why do they lack faith? We don't know exactly, but if you read the account in Mark, the Gospel of Mark, the writer adds something. He says one of the reason that they could not heal this boy is because that can only be done with prayer. Fasting and prayer. So it seems that they're trying to heal and cast out a demon with the authority they were given, but without a prayerful, dependent reliance on God as the source of their power. I get the sense, here's the sense I get, that they're overconfident in their own authority, and so they're relying on their commission rather than relying on Christ. One theologian describes the problem this way. It is essential for you to be cleansed of your blind love of self, that you may be made more aware of your inability, to feel your own weakness and learn to distrust yourself, that you may transfer your trust to God, to rest with a trustful heart in God, relying on His help, to take your stand in His grace rather than your ability. So you will understand the truth of His promises, and your hope will be strengthened. I think about it this way. If you've ever taken a lifeguarding class or seen how lifeguards work, one of the greatest dangers, one of the primary things that prevents a lifeguard from saving someone is them fighting back. The only way you can be saved by a lifeguard is when the lifeguard gets to you, you trust them. You stop fighting, you stop flailing, you rely on their power. What I see here is the disciples relying on their own authority, relying on their own position, not on Jesus' power. I think it's very important that we notice on multiple occasions, Jesus rebukes people for having little faith. He says, "Oh, ye of little faith." You got to go King James on that one. It's just in my DNA. "Oh, you of little faith." And in each instance, the people who have little faith are people like the disciples. And so if you were to look, who in the Bible has great faith? Who in the Gospel of Matthew has great faith? And it's people like the centurion that I mentioned. It's people like the Canaanite woman that I mentioned. You imagine here that this man would be an example of great faith. Now, what makes their faith great and the disciples' faith little? What makes these Gentiles have great faith? Or if you were to go to Matthew 9, you see another woman who has great faith, and it's a woman who's unclean according to the law. What makes their faith great and the disciples' faith little? When I see it, I think the difference is this. These people desperately depend on Jesus. They have a real and genuine faith that shows up as complete reliance on Jesus. They have no hope in their own ability to do it. They have no hope that they're going to be able to figure it out. They come to Jesus knowing that He is the only answer. They have no power or authority. All of their hope and trust is in Jesus. My question for us today is, do you and I desperately depend on Jesus daily? Do I need Jesus for my joy? Do I need Jesus for my provision? Do I need Jesus for my peace and my rest and my calling and my motivation and everything else? Or do I depend on myself? Do I think Jesus is just a nice addition to my well-managed life? Is Jesus just a nice mascot or a family tradition that I pay homage to? No, Jesus has to be all in all. See, if you're at the place in your life where you can't imagine making it another day without Jesus, then you're in the right place. But if you're at the place in your life where you could take Jesus or leave Him, then consider whether you have ever seen and believed in who He really is, because you haven't taken up your cross and denied yourself and followed Him. Jesus puts it this way, "For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." I love this. There's a subtle and profound point there that we may or may not make. See, if you were to think, what is the opposite of little faith? You would think big faith. But Jesus doesn't say the opposite of little faith is big faith. He says the opposite of little faith is faith like a mustard seed, which is kind of confusing because a mustard seed faith is small. Right? Mustard seeds aren't big. In fact, they're a common metaphor of the time for the smallest seed. So he's saying that the opposite of little faith is real and great faith, but it's still small faith. See, we think that bigger is better. Jesus isn't calling us to grand faith. He's calling us to authentic, real faith. One commentator describes it this way: faith is not a measurable commodity, but a relationship. And what achieves results through prayer is not a superior quantity of faith, but the unlimited power of God on which any faith can draw. The disciples, Jesus is implying here, failed to bring any faith at all to this situation. So when Jesus says, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can tell a mountain to move, He's not saying wave the magic wand and you can do whatever you want. He's saying faith in me, no matter how small, is that powerful. He's not trying to elevate their faith. He's trying to elevate His power. Because you can have the greatest faith, the most faith, in something that is unreliable and it does you no good. But if you have the smallest faith in Jesus, who is completely reliable and completely powerful, it is eternally powerful. So back to my first question. What does real world faith look like? Here's what I think real world faith looks like, summing it up from this passage. Real world faith is the kind of faith that sees Jesus at the center of all of life. Real world faith doesn't see Jesus as a means to an end, but sees him as the goal of life. He is the treasure. He is the prize. Real world faith is not presumptuous or performative. It doesn't rely on our feeble human attempts, but trust in Jesus to provide and protect. Real world faith doesn't draw attention to ourselves, but shows the strength of Jesus to hold us up. Real world faith is faith that trusts Jesus regardless of what this world brings, and as a result, makes a difference in this world for all who encounter it.